In the years immediately following the American Revolution, the United States existed in a state of uncertainty that is difficult to imagine today. Victory over the British Empire had secured independence, but it had not secured stability. The nation that emerged in 1783 was young, fragile, and deeply vulnerable. It had no powerful army, no strong central government, and no shared sense of national unity. What it had instead was debt, internal disagreement, and a vast unknown continent pressing against its western edge. At this early stage, the United States was not a continental power. It was a narrow collection of states hugging the Atlantic coastline. Most Americans lived within a few hundred miles of the ocean, dependent on maritime trade for survival. Their cities looked eastward, not westward. Europe remained the center of finance, culture, and diplomacy. America was peripheral, important to itself, but not yet important to the world. The physical geography of North America reinforced this limited vision. The Appalachian Mountains formed a massive natural barrier that separated the eastern settlements from the interior. In the 18th century, crossing these mountains was dangerous, slow, and expensive. Roads were few, maps were unreliable, and communication was inconsistent. For many Americans, the land beyond the mountains felt distant and hostile, more rumor than reality. The Mississippi River, far beyond the Appalachian Range, represented not an opportunity but a boundary, the edge of the known American world. Beyond that boundary lay territory controlled not by Americans but by powerful foreign empires and indigenous nations. France ruled the Louisiana Territory, an expanse so enormous that it dwarfed the size of the United States itself. Spain controlled Florida and much of the southern and southwestern regions. Britain remained firmly entrenched in Canada and the Great Lakes. Russia had begun extending its influence from Alaska down the Pacific coast. And throughout these lands lived hundreds of Native American nations, each with its own political systems, military strength, and alliances. These indigenous nations were not passive inhabitants waiting to be displaced. They were active powers in North America, shaping trade routes, diplomacy, and warfare. Confederations such as the Iroquois, Creek, Cherokee, and Shawnee had long histories of negotiation and conflict with European empires. Many viewed the Americans not as rightful successors to British rule, but as a new and unpredictable threat. Some allied with foreign powers specifically to contain American expansion. Internally, the United States was far from unified. The Articles of Confederation had created a weak central government that struggled to assert authority over the states. Congress lacked the power to tax effectively, regulate interstate commerce, or raise a permanent army. Each state pursued its own interests, often at the expense of national cohesion. Economic rivalries, regional identities, and political disagreements threatened to fracture the Union before it could fully take shape. Slavery further divided the nation. Northern and southern states disagreed not only on moral grounds but on economic survival. Expansion raised uncomfortable questions that leaders were not prepared to answer. Would new territories allow slavery or ban it? Would they tip the balance of power between regions? Could the Union survive if these disputes intensified? For many political leaders, expansion appeared less like an opportunity and more like a risk that could tear the country apart. Foreign governments understood these weaknesses clearly. Britain still viewed the United States as a former colony that might eventually be reclaimed or neutralized. Spanish officials feared American settlers spilling into their territories. French leaders worried that a growing republic could challenge European dominance in the New World. None of these powers wanted to see a unified, American nation stretching across the continent. A small, divided America was manageable. A large, expanding America was dangerous. At this moment in history, there was nothing inevitable about westward expansion. The United States could have chosen consolidation over growth. It could have focused on strengthening its institutions, stabilizing its economy, and avoiding confrontation with global empires. Many leaders argued for exactly that approach. They feared that rapid expansion would provoke war, empower separatist movements, and invite foreign intervention. History often presents America's growth as destiny, but destiny is a story told after success is achieved. In reality, the future was undecided. The United States stood at a crossroads. unsure whether it would remain a small Atlantic republic or attempt something far more ambitious. Every mile westward would require confrontation with geography, with native nations, with foreign empires, and with its own internal contradictions. At the end of the 18th century, America was not yet an empire in the making. It was an experiment struggling to survive. The choices made in the decades ahead would determine not only the fate of the United States, but the balance of power for the entire world. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, North America was not a blank canvas waiting for the United States to paint itself across it. It was already a chessboard of empires, each calculating its moves carefully, each aware that the rise or fall of one power could alter the entire global balance. For these empires, the newly independent United States was not simply another nation. It was an unpredictable force with enormous potential. And potential was often more dangerous than power itself. Britain was the first to recognize this danger. Although it had lost its 13 colonies, it had not lost its influence in North America. Canada remained firmly under British control, as did key trade routes through the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River. British officials understood that if the United States expanded westward, it would inevitably push northward as well, threatening British Canada. A strong, land-rich America could disrupt British trade, challenge naval dominance, and inspire further rebellion within the empire. Containing the United States became a strategic priority, not through direct reconquest, but through limitation. Britain encouraged Native American resistance along the frontier, maintained military forts in disputed regions, and used economic pressure to keep the young republic dependent and divided. To the south and west, Spain faced its own fears. Spanish America was vast but weakly governed, stretching from Florida across the Gulf Coast and deep into what is now the American Southwest. Spain lacked the population and military strength to fully secure these territories. American settlers, however, were numerous, mobile, and relentless. Spanish leaders worried that once Americans crossed certain borders, they would be impossible to stop. Expansion meant not just lost land, but the collapse of Spain's influence in the New World. For Spain, containing American growth was about survival, not rivalry. France approached the situation with a different mindset. Having supported the American Revolution, France initially saw the United States as a useful counterbalance to Britain. But French leaders were not blind to the risks. The Louisiana Territory, under French control for a brief but crucial period, represented both opportunity and liability. On one hand, it gave France immense leverage in North America. On the other, it required resources France did not have, especially during the turmoil of revolution and war in Europe. A growing American population pressing against Louisiana's borders posed a constant threat. France feared that if America expanded too aggressively, it would either seize the territory by force or become powerful enough to challenge French interests globally. Russia, though geographically distant, also had a stake in America's future. From its foothold in Alaska, Russia sought access to the Pacific coast and its lucrative fur trade. Russian expansion moved slowly, but its ambitions were clear. An American nation that reached the Pacific would inevitably block Russian influence and dominate Pacific trade routes. Even in the early 1800s, Russian officials viewed American expansion as a long-term obstacle to imperial goals. Beyond the European empires, indigenous nations played a central role in this struggle. They were not merely victims caught between competing powers. They were strategic actors with their own interests. Many native nations recognized that unchecked American expansion threatened their existence. To counter this, they formed alliances with Britain, Spain, and sometimes France. These alliances were based on mutual interest. European empires needed buffers against American growth, and indigenous nations needed military and political support. The frontier became a zone of constant tension, where diplomacy, warfare, and survival were intertwined. What united all these powers was a shared understanding: land was the foundation of power. Whoever controlled the interior of North America would control its resources, its trade routes, and eventually its military strength. The Mississippi River, in particular, was seen as a critical artery. Control of the river meant control of commerce across the continent. For foreign empires, allowing the United States unrestricted access to the Mississippi was equivalent to handing it the keys to future dominance. This is why American expansion was not simply a domestic issue, it was an international crisis in slow motion. Every new settlement, every treaty, every mile of land claimed by American settlers sent ripples through the global system. European diplomats debated how to restrain the United States without provoking open war. Military leaders prepared contingency plans. Economic strategists looked for ways to keep American trade dependent on European markets. At times, foreign powers actively targeted the United States through indirect means. They supported frontier uprisings, armed native resistance, manipulated trade agreements, and exploited internal American divisions. The goal was not necessarily to destroy the United States, but to prevent it from becoming too strong. A fragmented America could be influenced. A united, expanding America could not. The War of 1812 exposed just how high the stakes had become. Britain's willingness to fight the United States again, barely a generation after independence, was rooted in fear of American growth. Although the war ended without clear victory, it confirmed something crucial. The United States was willing to defend its expansion, even against the world's most powerful empire. For Britain and others, this was a warning. By the early 19th century, it was clear that the question was no longer whether America would attempt to expand, but whether it could be stopped. Foreign powers faced a difficult choice. They could confront the United States directly and risk a costly war, or they could retreat strategically and preserve their influence elsewhere. Many chose the latter not because America had already become unstoppable, but because its potential was too great to ignore. In this moment, the future of North America hung in the balance. Empires maneuvered, alliances shifted, and borders remained fluid. The United States stood at the center of these calculations, not as a dominant force, but as a rising one. How this struggle unfolded would determine whether America remained confined to the East or transformed into a continental power that reshaped the world. By the early 19th century, the United States faced a choice that would define its future. Surrounded by rival empires, divided internally, and unsure of its long-term survival, the nation had to decide whether it would remain confined to the eastern edge of North America or attempt to secure its future through expansion. Westward growth was not simply about ambition or ideology. It was driven by fear, necessity, and the belief that without land, the American experiment itself might collapse. Population growth was one of the most immediate pressures pushing the United States westward. The American population was expanding rapidly, fueled by high birth rates and increasing immigration from Europe. Eastern cities and farmlands began to feel crowded. For many Americans, land ownership was tied directly to independence and economic survival. Without new land, opportunities would shrink, wages would stagnate, and social unrest would grow. Expansion promised relief, a chance for ordinary citizens to own property and build a future. Economic survival also depended on access to resources and trade routes. The interior of North America offered fertile soil, timber, minerals, and access to rivers that could transport goods cheaply over long distances. The Mississippi River, in particular, became a matter of national security. American farmers depended on it to ship crops to global markets. Foreign control of the river threatened economic strangulation. Expansion was seen as the only way to ensure that the United States would not remain dependent on the goodwill of foreign empires. Security concerns weighed heavily on American leaders. As long as foreign powers controlled land to the west, the United States remained vulnerable. British forts in the Great Lakes region, Spanish influence in the south, and French control of Louisiana created a constant sense of danger. American policymakers feared encirclement. They believed that if the nation did not expand, its rivals eventually would, using frontier territories as launching points for invasion or manipulation. Expansion became a strategy of defense as much as growth. Ideology played a powerful role, but it did not emerge in isolation. The belief, later known as manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were destined to spread across the continent, was shaped by earlier experiences. Independence had convinced many that Republican government was superior to monarchy. Expansion became linked to the spread of liberty, self-rule, and opportunity. For supporters, moving west was not conquest. It was fulfillment. They believed that settling the land would secure freedom for future generations. Yet this ideology masked deeper contradictions. Expansion required displacement of indigenous nations, of rival empires, and often of moral restraint. Treaties were signed and broken. Military campaigns were justified as necessity. The promise of liberty for some came at the cost of destruction for others. Still, many Americans viewed these consequences as unavoidable. In their minds, failing to expand posed a greater threat than the ethical costs of doing so. Political leaders understood that expansion could also stabilize the fragile Union. New territories meant new states, which could balance regional power and reduce internal tension, at least temporarily. Expansion allowed politicians to postpone difficult debates, particularly over slavery. Instead of resolving conflicts, they pushed them westward, hoping space would provide solutions that compromise could not. This strategy delayed collapse, but it also ensured that future conflicts would be larger and more violent. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 marked a turning point. When the United States acquired the vast territory from France, it more than doubled in size overnight. The purchase was controversial and arguably unconstitutional, but it was driven by fear that a European power controlling the Mississippi River posed an unacceptable risk. With one decision, the United States committed itself to expansion. There was no turning back. The frontier was no longer distant. It was national policy. As settlers moved west, conflict followed. Indigenous nations resisted fiercely, understanding that American expansion threatened their existence. Foreign empires watched closely, weighing intervention against retreat. The frontier became a zone of constant violence, negotiation, and uncertainty. Yet each successful settlement reinforced the belief that expansion was both possible and necessary. Every mile gained made the next mile seem inevitable. Railroads, canals, and later roads transformed expansion from a slow migration into a powerful engine of growth. These projects connected distant territories to eastern markets, binding the nation together economically even as political divisions deepened. Expansion fueled industrialization, increased immigration, and strengthened the American economy. It also tied national identity to the idea of limitless growth. By mid-century, expansion had become inseparable from American self-image. To question it was to question the future of the nation itself. Critics warned of moral decay, endless war, and imperial overreach, but their voices were often drowned out by the promise of prosperity and security. The belief took hold that stopping expansion would mean stagnation, and stagnation would mean decline. In this context, expansion was no longer a choice. It was seen as survival. American leaders believed that if the nation did not claim the land, someone else would. They feared becoming a secondary power, hemmed in by rivals, forever vulnerable to foreign influence. Expansion offered an escape from that fate. It promised safety, wealth, and permanence. And yet, this path was not inevitable. The forces driving expansion were powerful, but they were not unstoppable. At several points, different decisions could have been made. Treaties could have held. Borders could have hardened. Internal divisions could have fractured the nation before it reached the Pacific. The fact that expansion succeeded does not mean it was destined. It means it was chosen. As the United States pushed westward, it reshaped North America and altered the balance of global power. But to understand what might have happened if America had stopped, we must first recognize why it moved forward at all. Expansion was not merely ambition. It was a response to fear, pressure, and the belief that the future belonged to those who claimed it first. By the middle of the 19th century, American expansion often appears in hindsight as an unstoppable force, a steady march westward driven by confidence and momentum. But when examined closely, this expansion was fragile, contested, and repeatedly on the brink of failure. At several critical moments, a different outcome was entirely possible. The United States could have stalled, fractured, or even reversed its westward movement. These turning points revealed just how uncertain America's rise truly was. One of the earliest and most significant moments of vulnerability came with the Louisiana Purchase itself. While celebrated today as a masterstroke, the decision was deeply controversial at the time. Many Americans believed the federal government had exceeded its constitutional authority. Others feared that the vast new territory would be impossible to govern, that it would dilute political power, and that it would encourage disunity. Some even argued that the nation should abandon the land rather than risk internal collapse. Had Congress rejected the purchase or demanded strict limits on settlement, America's Western future might have ended before it truly began. The War of 1812 represented another critical test. Britain, still the world's dominant naval power, sought to reassert its influence in North America and curb American expansion. British forces invaded from Canada, blockaded American ports, and even burned Washington, D.C. At the same time, Britain supported Native American resistance in the Western Territories, hoping to establish a buffer state that would permanently block U.S. expansion. A decisive British victory could have confined the United States to the east indefinitely. The fact that America survived the war was not a sign of overwhelming strength, but of narrow escape. Native resistance also posed a sustained and underestimated threat to westward expansion. Indigenous nations fought not as isolated groups, but often as coordinated confederations. Leaders such as Tecumseh envisioned a unified native front capable of halting American settlement. For a time, this vision came close to success. American armies suffered defeats, frontier settlements were abandoned, and expansion slowed. If native alliances had received stronger or longer-lasting support from foreign powers, American control of the interior could have been delayed for generations. Economic instability further threatened the expansion project. The early 19th century was marked by financial crises, including the Panic of 1819, which devastated banks, farmers, and settlers. Land speculation collapsed, credit dried up, and thousands lost their livelihoods. Expansion required enormous financial investment in infrastructure, defense, and governance. During periods of economic crisis, many questioned whether the nation could afford to push west at all. Prolonged instability could have forced a retreat from the frontier. Internal political divisions were perhaps the most dangerous obstacle. As new territories formed, the question of slavery became increasingly explosive. Each new state threatened to upset the balance between free and slave states, intensifying sectional tensions. Compromises such as the Missouri Compromise temporarily preserved unity, but they did not resolve the underlying conflict. At multiple points, political deadlock nearly paralyzed the government. Had these compromises failed earlier, the Union might have fractured long before reaching the Pacific. Foreign intervention remained a constant possibility. Spain and later Mexico struggled to maintain control over their northern territories, but they did not relinquish them willingly. American settlers in Texas and California lived under foreign rule for decades, often in uneasy coexistence. Without strong federal support, these settlements could have been crushed or expelled. A more stable and assertive Mexico might have successfully blocked American expansion into the Southwest, altering the continent's political map permanently. Even geography worked against the United States at times. The Great Plains were once described as the Great American Desert, believed to be unsuitable for farming. The Rocky Mountains appeared insurmountable. Harsh climates, disease, and isolation claimed countless lives. For many settlers, the frontier was not a land of opportunity but of suffering. High failure rates discouraged further migration. If these environmental challenges had proven more severe, expansion could have slowed to a halt. Perhaps most importantly, expansion relied on sustained belief. Americans needed to believe that the risks were worth taking, that the future lay to the west, and that success was possible. This belief was repeatedly shaken by war, economic collapse, and political crisis. There were moments when the idea of stopping, consolidating, and turning inward gained serious traction. Leaders debated whether the nation had grown too large, too fast. What ultimately pushed the United States forward through these turning points was not inevitability, but persistence combined with opportunity. Rivals hesitated when they might have struck decisively. Internal conflicts were postponed rather than resolved. Technological advances slowly overcame geographic barriers. Each success created momentum, making retreat increasingly unthinkable. Yet it is essential to recognize that history could have turned differently at any of these moments. A lost war, a failed compromise, a stronger foreign empire, or a deeper economic collapse could have frozen American borders far short of the Pacific. The path west was not a straight line. It was a narrow road lined with failure on both sides. Understanding these turning points helps clarify how fragile America's expansion truly was. It reminds us that power is not born fully formed, but assembled piece by piece, often in defiance of circumstance. The United States did not expand because it had to. It expanded because, time and again, it survived moments that could have stopped it. With this context, we can now imagine an alternative outcome more clearly. What if one of these turning points had gone differently? What if America had failed to push past its limits? To answer that, we must now step fully into the alternate timeline, where expansion ends and the consequences begin. Imagine a single moment where history tilts in another direction, not through catastrophe, but through hesitation. A treaty enforced rather than broken, a war lost rather than survived, a political compromise that fails instead of holding. In this alternate timeline, the United States does not collapse, but it stops. The Mississippi River becomes more than a river. It becomes a permanent border. In this version of history, American leaders decide that further expansion is too dangerous. The cost in blood, money, and political unity has grown too high. Foreign pressure remains constant, native resistance is stronger and more unified, and internal divisions, especially over slavery, are no longer containable through territorial growth. Faced with the real possibility of national fracture, Congress draws a line. Settlement beyond the Mississippi is restricted. Federal protection for Western settlers is withdrawn. Expansion, once seen as survival, is now viewed as an existential risk. At first, the decision seems temporary, a pause, not an end. But pauses have a way of becoming permanent. As years pass, the frontier stabilizes. Military forts turn into border checkpoints. Trade across the river continues, but political control does not. The United States consolidates its eastern territories, investing in infrastructure, industry, and coastal trade. It grows inward rather than outward. Across the Mississippi, the continent evolves differently. Without American settlers flooding west, other powers fill the vacuum. Britain strengthens its influence southward from Canada, securing the Great Lakes and much of the northern interior. French cultural and economic influence lingers in the Mississippi Valley through trade networks and alliances. Even if formal political control fades, Spain and later Mexico retain firmer control over the Southwest, from Texas to California. These regions develop their own identities, economies, and political trajectories, no longer overshadowed by an expanding United States. Indigenous nations experience a radically different future. Without relentless American settlement, many retain significant autonomy. Confederations solidify borders, strengthen governments, and engage in diplomacy as recognized regional powers rather than obstacles to expansion. Some form buffer states between empires, while others evolve into hybrid societies combining indigenous traditions with European trade and governance. Conflict does not disappear, but survival becomes possible in ways it never was in our timeline. Within the United States, the absence of Western expansion reshapes politics immediately. The slavery question, once deferred by new territories, explodes sooner and more intensely. Without the promise of new lands to balance free and slave states, compromise becomes impossible. The nation faces a reckoning decades earlier than in real history. Whether this leads to an earlier civil war, a negotiated separation, or gradual abolition varies by interpretation, but what is clear is that the country can no longer outrun its contradictions. Economically, the United States develops along a different path. Lacking access to vast Western resources, it focuses heavily on manufacturing, maritime trade, and financial services. Eastern cities grow denser and more powerful. The nation resembles a hybrid of Britain and early industrial Europe, a compact, commercially driven state rather than a sprawling continental empire. Wealth concentrates faster, inequality deepens, and class tensions rise. The myth of endless land no longer cushions economic hardship. Internationally, the United States occupies an ambiguous position. It is no longer surrounded by weak or retreating powers, but by stable rivals. Britain views the U.S. as a competitor, not a threat. Mexico sees it as a neighbor, not an invader. European diplomacy treats America as a secondary power, important but not decisive. The United States influences trade and regional politics, but it does not dominate them. Crucially, without a Pacific coastline, America never becomes a bridge between East and West. Trade with Asia remains largely in European hands. No American naval presence emerges in the Pacific. No California gold rush fuels explosive growth. No transcontinental railroad binds the continent together. Immigration slows, reshaping the nation's demographic and cultural development. America remains influential, but contained. As decades pass, the psychological impact of stopping expansion becomes profound. National identity shifts. The frontier myth fades before it fully forms. Instead of celebrating conquest and mobility, American culture emphasizes stability, order, and preservation. The idea of America as a new world gives way to America as a settled world. Innovation continues, but ambition narrows. Meanwhile, the rest of North America grows more complex. Multiple nations compete, cooperate, and clash across the continent. Power remains fragmented. No single state dominates. This balance prevents rapid industrial consolidation but also avoids the overwhelming dominance of one superpower. The continent becomes a mosaic rather than a monolith. This is the moment where history diverges completely. By choosing to stop, the United States avoids some tragedies but sacrifices scale, influence, and destiny. The nation survives, but it does not ascend. It becomes one power among many, rather than the power that reshapes the world. And it is here, in this stabilized but divided North America, that the global consequences begin to unfold. Because when America does not expand, it does not rise in the same way, and when America does not rise, the entire course of world history bends in a different direction. With the United States halted at the Mississippi River, North America develops not as a unified continental system, but as a fragmented and competitive landscape. The absence of a single dominant power reshapes the continent into a patchwork of nations, spheres of influence, and contested borderlands. Instead of one flag stretching from ocean to ocean, multiple political identities emerge, each shaped by different histories, alliances, and ambitions. To the north, British influence deepens. Canada expands its reach southward into the Great Lakes and upper Mississippi regions, consolidating control over trade routes and natural resources. The British Empire, no longer facing an expanding American rival, invests more heavily in its North American holdings. Rail networks, ports, and cities develop with imperial support. Canada evolves into a powerful, semi-autonomous dominion earlier than in our timeline, acting as Britain's primary anchor on the continent. South and west of the American border, Mexico's position strengthens. Without constant American pressure, Mexico retains greater control over Texas, California, and the Southwest. These territories develop more slowly but more cohesively, tied to Mexican political and cultural institutions. California does not experience an explosive gold rush-driven population boom. Instead, it becomes a Pacific-oriented society influenced by Spanish, indigenous, and Asian trade networks. Mexico remains a major continental power, not weakened by territorial loss. Across the interior, indigenous nations occupy a radically different role. Free from relentless American settlement, many establish recognized borders and stable governments. Some become buffer states between empires. Others act as trade hubs linking Eastern America with Western territories. Though conflicts still arise, indigenous societies are not systematically dismantled. Their survival reshapes the cultural and political identity of the continent, preserving languages, traditions, and governance systems that were nearly erased in real history. Within the eastern United States, political and economic development accelerates inward. Cities grow taller and denser. Industry becomes the primary engine of growth. Manufacturing hubs dominate the economy, and labor movements emerge earlier and more forcefully. Without new land to absorb population pressure, urbanization intensifies. Social tensions sharpen. Class divisions become more visible, forcing earlier debates about workers' rights, regulation, and social reform. The political system evolves under constant pressure. Without the safety valve of expansion, the United States confronts its internal contradictions head-on. Slavery, labor, immigration, and federal authority cannot be postponed or exported westward. This leads to earlier restructuring, whether through reform, division, or conflict. The result is a nation that stabilizes, but only after painful transformation. Militarily, the balance of power remains regional. No massive American army projects force across the continent. Instead, multiple nations maintain moderate forces, focused on defense rather than domination. Wars are smaller, more localized, and often resolved through diplomacy rather than total conquest. North America resembles Europe in this respect, a region defined by balance rather than supremacy. Economically, trade flows in many directions rather than through a single hub. British, Mexican, indigenous, and American economies interconnect without one overwhelming the others. Innovation occurs, but it spreads unevenly. No single nation dictates standards, currency systems, or industrial norms. Global markets remain more fragmented, slower to integrate, and more resistant to monopoly power. Culturally, the absence of a dominant American identity transforms global influence. No single language, entertainment industry, or cultural narrative overshadows the rest. Hollywood never becomes a global force. English competes more evenly with Spanish and indigenous languages across the continent. Cultural exchange becomes regional rather than global, diverse rather than homogenized. Politically, North America becomes a region of negotiation. Borders are respected but flexible. Alliances shift based on trade and security needs. No country can act unilaterally without consequences. This limits rapid expansion but also reduces the likelihood of total war. Stability comes at the cost of speed and scale. From a global perspective, the most significant change is what does not happen. There is no sudden rise of a continental superpower capable of reshaping global politics within a single century. Instead, power remains distributed. Europe continues to dominate global affairs longer. Asia's balance evolves differently. The world remains multipolar by default, not by resistance. This divided continent produces a different kind of future. Progress is slower, but collapse is less dramatic. Innovation is shared, but breakthroughs are rarer. The idea of one nation shaping the destiny of many never takes root here. North America becomes a space of coexistence rather than conquest. And it is this altered balance, this absence of overwhelming American power, that sends shockwaves beyond the continent. Because when America does not rise as it did in our timeline, the 20th century unfolds in an entirely different way. Global wars, empires, and ideologies evolve without a decisive American presence. To understand how deep that impact runs, we must now look outward to the world beyond North America and imagine how global history changes when America never becomes the dominant force we know today. With the United States confined to the eastern seaboard and North America divided among multiple powers, the world beyond the continent evolves along a profoundly different trajectory. The absence of a continental superpower reshapes the global balance in ways that touch Europe, Asia, Africa, and beyond. What we take for granted as American influence in global affairs simply does not exist, or it emerges in a far smaller, more localized form. In Europe, the consequences are immediate. In our timeline, the United States provided a counterweight to European ambitions, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries. Without an expanding America pressing westward and eventually projecting power across oceans, Britain, France, and Germany face fewer challenges to their influence. The balance of power remains heavily European-centered. Britain retains its global trade dominance longer, relying on Canada as a secure foothold in North America. France maintains stronger influence in the Caribbean and Louisiana region, preserving colonial holdings without constant American pressure. Germany, later unified, encounters fewer constraints in its early imperial ambitions. The result is a world where Europe remains politically and militarily dominant for decades longer than in our history. The absence of a dominant United States also fundamentally changes global conflicts. World War I and World War II may occur differently, or perhaps in altered form entirely. Without American industrial and military capacity, the Allies are deprived of critical support. Battles that relied on American troops, supplies, and economic power are drawn out or may tilt in favor of Axis or Central powers. The geopolitical map of the 20th century is redrawn. Europe remains the decisive arena, while North America is largely a regional stage. Wars are prolonged, outcomes are less certain, and the global influence of ideologies such as democracy and liberal capitalism spreads more slowly. In Asia, the consequences are equally profound. American economic and military involvement in the Pacific does not materialize. Trade with China, Japan, and Southeast Asia continues largely under European or local control. Colonization patterns in Southeast Asia, India, and China's spheres of influence are extended, as there is no American Pacific presence to challenge European dominance. The United States' absence delays technological and cultural exchanges that historically accelerated globalization. Regional powers retain more autonomy, and Asia's trajectory is shaped less by American intervention and more by European imperial competition and local politics. Africa experiences similar effects. Without American pressure for abolition, economic influence, and diplomatic engagement, European colonization proceeds with less opposition. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade is delayed in some regions, and post-colonial independence movements emerge later, giving European empires a longer period of uncontested control. American financial and technological investment, which historically facilitated African development, is absent. The result is a slower, more fractured path to modern statehood. The technological and cultural dimensions of a world without a rising America are equally transformative. Without coast-to-coast expansion and the wealth it generated, American innovation is smaller in scale and slower to globalize. Silicon Valley never emerges as the epicenter of digital technology. Hollywood remains regional. Global communications, entertainment, and technological standards develop under European, Japanese, or other influences. English remains important, but it competes with Spanish, French, Portuguese, and local languages on a much larger scale. Even global migration patterns are altered. Millions of Europeans who historically saw the American West as a land of opportunity instead migrate to Canada, Latin America, or urban centers in Europe. Population pressure in the United States remains high, but the lack of land limits settlement and mobility. This changes the cultural and demographic composition of the Americas, making the continent more diverse politically, linguistically, and socially, but less unified under a single global identity. Trade and economic networks evolve differently as well. The United States does not dominate the Atlantic economy. Britain, France, and other European powers maintain tighter control over transatlantic trade routes. Global finance remains concentrated in London, Paris, and Amsterdam rather than spreading to New York as a world financial hub. Economic globalization happens, but unevenly, with North America acting as one of several regional players rather than the central engine. Perhaps most fundamentally, the idea of a single superpower shaping the world is absent. Without the United States, the 20th century may see multiple competing powers rather than a bipolar world dominated by the US and the Soviet Union. The Cold War as we know it likely does not occur. Regional conflicts, ideological struggles, and economic competition remain complex, multipolar, and unpredictable. The world is less ordered, more contested, and more fragile, with no single nation capable of enforcing global norms. Yet, paradoxically, this absence also creates a kind of stability. Without American intervention, wars are often localized rather than globalized. International law develops more slowly, and global institutions emerge differently. The world is not necessarily more peaceful, but it is less homogenized. Power is distributed, influence is regionalized. Nations act primarily in their own interests, and global unity is far more difficult to achieve. In short, when America stops at the Mississippi, the consequences radiate far beyond the continent. North America is fragmented, regional powers are strengthened, and the global balance shifts toward Europe and local empires. Wars, trade, culture, and technology all evolve along different paths. The modern world, the world dominated by American economic, military, and cultural influence simply does not exist. Instead, a more fractured, multipolar, and unpredictable globe takes shape. By examining this alternate history, we see how contingent our present truly is. The rise of the United States was not preordained. It depended on choice, risk, and circumstance. And when one decision, the decision to push westward, had consequences, it reshaped not only the nation itself, but the entire world. A smaller, constrained America produces a smaller, constrained world, demonstrating that power, influence, and history are all deeply interwoven with the choices of a single nation. Looking back at this alternate history, it becomes clear that the question of American expansion is not merely an academic exercise. It is a lens through which we can better understand how power is formed, how fear shapes decisions, and how fragile the course of history truly is. When the United States stops at the Mississippi River, the world that emerges is not unrecognizable, but it is fundamentally different. And in those differences lie lessons that still matter today. One of the most important lessons is that power is never inevitable. The modern tendency to view the United States as a destined superpower obscures the reality of how close history came to taking another path. America's rise depended on geography, timing, political will, and the weakness or hesitation of rivals. Remove just one of these elements and the outcome changes dramatically. This reminds us that nations rise not because they are meant to, but because circumstances align and choices are made often under pressure and uncertainty. Another lesson lies in the role of fear as a driving force in history. The United States expanded west not only out of ambition, but out of fear of being surrounded by rival empires, fear of economic stagnation, fear of internal collapse. In our alternate timeline, choosing to stop expansion reduces some dangers but amplifies others. This mirrors modern geopolitics, where nations often justify expansion, intervention, or control in the name of security. History shows that fear can preserve a nation, but it can also trap it within self-imposed limits. This alternate history also highlights the relationship between land and identity. In real history, westward expansion shaped how Americans understood themselves as pioneers, settlers, and builders of a vast frontier. Without that experience, national identity narrows. Culture becomes more inward-looking, more cautious, and more hierarchical. This demonstrates how geography influences not just power but values. The stories nations tell about themselves are often rooted in the land they control or fail to control. Equally important is the lesson about balance and fragmentation. In a world without a dominant United States, power remains distributed. This prevents the overwhelming influence of a single nation, but it also complicates cooperation. Multipolar systems encourage negotiation and restraint, yet they are also prone to instability and prolonged conflict. The alternate world is not necessarily more peaceful, it is simply less centralized. This reflects ongoing debates about whether global stability depends on strong leadership or shared power. The survival and strength of indigenous nations in this timeline offer another critical insight. Their near erasure in real history was not inevitable. It was the result of deliberate policies tied to expansion. When expansion stops, indigenous societies adapt, govern, and persist as political actors rather than historical footnotes. This forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about progress and cost. What is gained by expansion is often built on what is lost, and history rarely records those losses equally. The global consequences also underscore how interconnected the world truly is. Without American expansion, Europe dominates longer, colonization persists, technological progress spreads unevenly, and global culture fragments. No single nation accelerates globalization at the pace we recognize today. This suggests that modern interconnectedness, for all its flaws, was shaped by specific historical conditions rather than universal trends. Change happens faster when power is concentrated and slower when it is not. Perhaps the most striking lesson is how one decision can echo across centuries. The choice to expand west was not made in a single moment, but through countless smaller decisions, treaties signed and broken, wars fought or avoided, laws passed under pressure. Each step reinforced the next until the path seemed unavoidable. But as this alternate history shows, inevitability is often an illusion created by hindsight. At any point, history can turn. Understanding this helps us see the present more clearly. Modern nations face their own crossroads decisions about borders, resources, technology, and influence. Like early America, they operate under uncertainty, surrounded by rivals, driven by fear and hope in equal measure. The past reminds us that today's choices will shape tomorrow's world in ways that are impossible to fully predict. In the end, asking, "What if America never expanded west?" is not about diminishing what happened. It is about recognizing how fragile and contingent history is. The world we live in is not the only one that could have existed. It is simply the one that emerged from a specific chain of decisions. By exploring the path not taken, we gain perspective on the power of choice, the cost of ambition, and the responsibility that comes with shaping the future. History is not destiny, it is direction. And direction is always chosen